Constitutions Minister Scott Bryson had to say.
The spirit of our electoral system rests on a fair and level playing field. It is crucial that political actors with the deepest pockets do not dominate the debate. Canadians want to hear, they deserve to hear from all sides on a level playing field.
Bill C-76 proposes to limit the length of federal election campaigns to no longer than 50 days. Political parties would be required to create and submit privacy policies to Election Canada to protect voters' personal information. There will also be new rules to regulate campaign and third-party spending. Political parties would be able to spend a total of $1.5 million on partisan advertising. Third-party organizations would be capped at $500,000 each. But foreign entities wouldn't be allowed to spend any money on elections, including the buying of ads. Voter information cards will once again become a valid piece of identification for voting. That repeals a change made by the previous Conservative government in 2014. The Liberals would also repeal statutes that make Canadian citizens ineligible to vote after living abroad for 5 years. But will these changes help Canada avoid the scourge of fake news and foreign interference in election campaigns? Let's talk to our panel. And just a reminder, we are streaming this panel live on Facebook right now and on YouTube. You can join in on CBC News page on either website. Now, our panelists tonight in Vancouver, Charles Adler, host of Charles Adler Tonight. In Ottawa, Duff Conacher, co-founder of Democracy Watch. And in Toronto, Muniza Sheikh, an employment lawyer and communications director with the Canadian Muslim Vote. All right, I want to divide this panel into two areas tonight. One, the idea that these changes will alleviate what's called in some quarters voter suppression by making it easier to vote. And second, the concept that we would be able to avoid the issues that they've had in the United States, Russian interference and the rise of fake news, for example. And let's start there. Duff Conacher, let me ask you, how far did these changes go to securing the safety and integrity of our elections?
Not enough, not far enough. There are some good changes, but they're essentially going to increase the spending limit for interest groups. So that brings in more big money as opposed to stopping big money. And we already have problems with the donation limit being too high and spending limits being too high in some cases. And then also, they're not requiring social media companies in particular to report advertising that interest groups or wealthy individuals might run. And they're in the best position to report it because they know who is running the ad, how much they're paying for it, and also what the ad says. And that has to be added to this bill or it won't stop secret, fake online election ads, and we'll see the problems of big money advertising in secret and micro-targeting, including from foreigners, as happened in the U.S.
Duff, what my understanding was, and this is from our online piece, is that organizations selling advertising space be barred from knowingly accepting election ads from foreign entities. Does that cover it?
No, because are they really going to rat themselves out? And if they are caught running something, they'll just say we didn't know. So it's going to be enormously difficult to investigate and prove that they knew. They cannot be allowed to self-regulate in this area, Facebook and the other big social media companies. And the Liberals should not be rolling over on them just because Facebook Canada's head of public policy has formerly worked with the Liberal Party. They have to be required to report to the election agency so that Elections Canada can track whether the ad violates spending limits and also whether it makes false statements. Because false statements are illegal, and also whether it's funded by foreigners.
All right. Muniza, what do you think? How far do these rules go in terms of securing the integrity of our elections?
You know, as mentioned by one of your other panel members, probably not far enough. I mean, when I look at the spirit behind the legislation, you know, I like what I hear. Admittedly, it's still early days. And I have lots to say about, you know, the role Elections Canada plays here, especially because I understand they motivated a lot of these changes to the legislation. But we'll park that, I think, for the second part of your panel. Speaking about, you know, privacy and legislation, personally as a lawyer, taking off my Canadian Muslim vote hat, if I can for a moment, you know, I really think it's more of a a quick fix. I think, instead what we really need to see is some changes, astronomical changes to privacy legislation in this country that is severely outdated. I mean, we saw a number of recommendations, I think close to 19 or 20 recommendations that came down to Minister Navdeep Bains about how we can make changes to our privacy legislation to protect all Canadians. And I do wonder a little bit if, some of the discussion around, privacy legislation as it relates to, what happened in the U.S. with respect to, purported Russian interference and Facebook. I wonder if it's just a public quick fix when I would have preferred to see changes to privacy laws in this country.
Charles, what do you think? Do you think it's just a quick fix?
Yeah, I don't think there's much here, because I think Facebook is the nuclear bomb, and I think we've discovered that of late. And if we don't acknowledge that, then we're simply not acknowledging what is the most powerful weapon, whether they're foreign interests or domestic interests. That's the most powerful weapon that people can use. And as far as I can tell, there's absolutely nothing here that detonates the bomb.
Okay, you know what? I'm going to go to our Facebook page now, and people are writing in, and overwhelmingly, here's what people are asking, and I'll just read a couple of the questions. Most of them have the same thing. How about the electoral reform we were promised? Yes. Then there's that little first past the post promise. Election reform would not benefit the Liberal Party, hence they abandoned their election pledge. I voted Liberal because they said they would reform our totally unfair first past the post system, and on it goes. Duff.
Yes. Not surprisingly at all, because this legislation does not make up for that broken promise in any way, shape, or form. And unfortunately, it's going to narrow the definition of what a false statement is under the election law. And it should be expanding it instead to cover promises and ensure that voters have a right to honest promises. We just filed a complaint with the Commissioner of Canada Elections. There is a provision in the law that says you can't mislead voters. Commissioner of Canada Elections is refusing to enforce that, even though Prime Minister Trudeau made a clear promise and clearly broke it, and also misled voters about why he broke it. So it's a very serious issue, honesty in politics. It's a #1 hot button for voters, and the Liberals have failed to address this. And picking up on another comment made earlier as well, the Liberals are not proposing to require the political parties to follow the federal privacy law. They're saying they're empowering them to do that. They're already empowered to do that. They don't need this legislation to change anything in that way. What they need is actually to require the federal political parties to follow the federal privacy law in terms of how they deal with voter information. So 2 ways that the Liberals are letting themselves and the other big parties off the hook.
Maniza?
Well, if I can pipe in here, I mean, my big issue, and now I'm putting my Canadian Muslim Vote hat on, I'm the Director of Communications for that organization, and, our organization engages voter participation at all levels of government through education. So I have to tell you, Carol, I do feel a little disappointed here, because this would have been a fantastic community opportunity, now moving away from privacy, now moving away and focusing on accessibility. When dealing with accessibility as it relates to these proposed changes.
Sorry, are you talking about, Maniza, the responding to what people are saying online about where's the this doesn't cover the promise to change the first past the post. Where's that promise?
Well, you know what? In that discussion, Carol, it does tie into a number of promises made by the liberal government, as far as it relates to, creating an election process that is, inclusive. And so that's really what my discussion is on. And what I'm suggesting is, when looking at, something that we would have needed from this current government, and especially this was a great opportunity for Elections Canada to say, let's put some funding back in to deal with the, the significant roadblock we have for ethnocultural communities. I can tell you, there was significant funding that was taken away, back under the Harper era that dealt with diverse communities. Back in 2004, we saw a significant amount of funding that was provided to Elections Canada so they could work with not just Aboriginal communities, not just a young voter base, not just Canadians with disability, but also ethnocultural communities, which are communities that the Canadian Muslim Vote works with, and other communities as well.
I want to talk more about that in just a moment. Charles, I want to get your sense of does this get the government off the hook for, what do you think about people's complaint that, well, wait a minute, what happened to the big promise, which was first past the post? Do you think the government is going to pay for that?
I'm a first past the post guy, but I totally agree with the people who are commenting. If that's a passion of yours, Trudeau, look, I mean, the reason Trudeau got a large majority, where the Liberals have a large majority, is not because Conservatives were abandoning the Conservative Party in droves, but they were abandoning the Mulcair NDP as if it were the Titanic, And one of the reasons they were abandoning the NDP is because Trudeau was luring them with passionately promising to make this last election the last first past the post election. Look, you've got much of this country where the NDP barely gets to be number 3, so I can understand why proportional representation is holy grail for them, as well as, of course, the Green Party. So if you're pro-Green or pro-NDP, you've got to be hating what Trudeau has done to your promise. He's violated it, and of course, what we're talking about today has absolutely nothing to do with that. And if the Liberals think that what we are talking about today is going to make people forget about yesterday, they're sadly mistaken.
All right, let's talk about accessibility, and I'm going to take this piece by piece because I'm going to let Facebook drive it, the people on Facebook. And one of the more controversial issues right now is expats being allowed to vote. As you know, the Conservative government said if you were out of the country for more than 5 years, you weren't allowed to vote in the election. This bill would repeal that. And Melinda Jarrett says, I think expats should be allowed to vote. Why not? They are interested enough in their country of birth to be motivated to vote. Jeannie Harris, why would someone who does not live in Canada want to vote and shape our future? And if you don't live here, Colin Duanson says on Facebook, you don't have a say. Simple as that. Expats should have no vote. Duff.
No, I think it's fine that they do. They are going to essentially remove all the restrictions. I think there is an argument for some restriction after a certain period of time, or if you've confirmed that you will not be returning to the country, then that would be a fine restriction that would, I think, survive a charter test. Just to remove it completely, I think, is going a bit too far. But they should be allowed to vote even if they're out of the country for years and years, because lots of people maintain ties and intend to return and have an interest in terms of family or possibly property here that is affected by government decisions.
Okay, I'm going to move along. We have about 3 minutes left, and I want to get to some of the things that Maniza raised earlier.
Yes,
that I also intended to bring up in order.
Yes.
So let's go through it again. The new rules: reinstating vouching, restoring the option of using a voter information card as a valid form of ID, reauthorizing voting rights for Canadians who lived outside the country, and also the Elections Canada allowed to do some advertising to educate voters. Maniza.
So the accessibility piece, Carol, thank you, is the one that I'm the most interested in, from the perspective of Canadian Muslim Vote, and obviously other organizations that do work in Canada with communities who historically, when looking at the national average in terms of who votes, simply are not there in terms of the numbers. So back in 2004, Elections Canada had the funding to hire, I think it was something like 59 ethnocultural officers who would then, run almost like an election readiness campaign. So something that our organization does, and that means, putting up signs and attending community events and doing outreach. And then with the Harper government, we saw the funding, depleted in that area, and the funding remained for Aboriginal communities, which completely significant for younger for young Canadians, for people with disabilities. But I can tell you, as somebody who works with ethnic communities in this country, there's a number of reasons as to why they're not voting. And so to me, it is a little disappointing that Elections Canada, who again motivated a number of these legislative changes, didn't say, here's an amazing category for us to, put some money into. And instead, all I really see, and admittedly, Carol, it's still early days, all I really see is, we might, we might reimburse one of the political parties, if they're providing, sign language or something of that nature. And I think this would have been a great opportunity to go so much further than that and provide the funding to communities that need it so very desperately.
And what would that money be spent on?
That money would be spent on, if Elections Canada doesn't necessarily want to do what they did back in 2004, maybe it was a dated approach to hire ethnocultural officers, provide funding to organizations like ours who, again, are trying to push civic engagement. And I simply haven't seen any of that discussion, and it would have been a great opportunity, Carol.
All right, Charles, what do you think about the repeal of these certain things, restoring the option of using voter information cards as a valid form of ID, reinstating vouching?
I'm all for reinstating vouching. I'm all for the business about the cards being enough. I'm totally dead set against giving expats the right to vote. I've been an expat myself, and I had the right to vote, and I didn't take it simply because I felt I don't have to face the consequences. So giving people a right to do something when they don't really have to face the tax consequences and other consequences, I'm not for that at all. So I'm not happy about that.
I think diversity breeds creativity, and and on that note, I think there's a bit of a distorted perception as to what it means as someone who's living out of the country. And if ultimately you're interested enough to vote, then I would say presumably you can make the argument that there's an interest in the affairs of the country that you've got citizenship for.
And
voting to me is not a poll. It's not about just being interested. It's about being an active citizen. You're not an active citizen when you're outside the country just because you're watching what's going on online.
Not necessarily true.
I just don't buy that.
Neither do I.
A small percentage of them vote as well, so it's not really a big issue. And on the voter education, I would hope that in the budget we will see some of that money next budget round in the spring of 2019. It's not something that would be in a bill. Money is not in a bill like this, but the money can still come in the next budget. Hopefully we'll get some changes as well to actually protect the integrity and stop big money in the next federal election, the way this bill does not do right now.
Oh, even so, I think I read something earlier from, it was a quote from Stéphane Perrault, the acting chief electoral officer, warning that if the government wants changes to be in place for the next federal election in 2019, it's going to be tight. So
yes.
Wouldn't count on it.
That I'll agree with, Carol.
Charles Adler, Duff Conacher, Muniza Sheikh, thank you all very much.
Thanks very much, Carol.
Okay. And coming up, a Toronto police officer convicted of attempted murder in the shooting death of a Toronto teenager loses his appeal. We'll tell you what that means for Constable James Frasillo next.